One of those boomers who elevated freak into a compliment and turned party into a verb.
I was more worried about the mindless stunt he'd pulled in Norton's office because it meant Lenny's manic cycle could be kicking in.
The one on Mother's chest, noun that taught me scar, raised stripe where a breast had been.
This pitcher was the strikeout king of the league. People weren't supposed to hit home runs off of him, let alone me. I was not necessarily a long ball hitter.
I didn't know much about Lincoln. I didn't know much about, actually, I didn't know all that much about Nebraska. Mm-hmm. But my wife and I at the time had 3 children. And from, I think, day one, we liked Lincoln. And I found a home at that Wesleyan. I found it to be a very open liberal arts college. And we had no doubts about staying. We've just been here ever since. I did my undergraduate degree at Nebraska State University in Kansas. I went into the Marine Corps, and after 2 years after 2 years in the Marine Corps, I taught for 1 year in a Kansas high school. Then I went back to Emporia State and got my master's degree. Taught 4 years at Wichita State, and then came to Lincoln to work on my advanced degree at the University of Nebraska. I'm a small town guy. I grew up in a real small town. Lincoln for me is not a small town, but on the other hand, Lincoln is not a huge metropolis. And Lincoln has its sections. I lived in Northeast Lincoln for a number of years, and when people asked me where I was from, I would say Northeast Lincoln. Northeast Lincoln had its own little town identity. You know, Havelock, and then there's Bethany, and so on. So I feel like that Lincoln is kind of a neighborhood city. In fact, that was the name I would like to have had it called. Instead of the Star City, then it's the neighborhood city. So I think it's a wonderful name, and it fits. Star is all right, but neighborhood is more apt. I started writing fiction in graduate school. I wanted to write the great American novel, so I got permission to write a novel for my master's thesis. And after that, I dabbled in short fiction. And I didn't write poetry until sometime later. In fact, I think I'd been teaching here in Lincoln at Wesleyan for about 6 or 7 years before I wrote my first poem. And thereafter, I've been mostly interested in poetry, though I still like fiction, and I like creative nonfiction. I guess for me, what it boils down to is the story. I like the story, whether it's in fiction or creative nonfiction or in poetry. I tend to write poems that have stories in them. Well, I haven't always, because I didn't write my first. I didn't have my first collection of poems until I was about 37 or 38 years old. But I've always been interested, or for a long time before that, interested in language. And that certainly has something to do with the desire to write. Yes. But I'm kind of in terms of writing, sort of a late bloomer, I guess, a late starter. 37, 38, I don't know if that's later or not. Oh, that's I like to get things down, so I know what my attitude toward them is. I'm not really quite sure sometimes what the attitude is until I get serious, till I get on the page. And I also like to have a record of how I felt at the time I was writing something. I mean, I remember writing a poem for our first child, a girl. And shortly after she was born, I wrote a poem about her. And I like to go back to that poem. It reminds me of the event, and it reminds me of what my attitude toward that birth was at the time. And I just find that sometimes necessarily refreshing. Also, there's something about giving order to something on the page that that gives me some satisfaction. It may be an event that was unfortunate or tragic or whatever, but you can still bring some kind of order to that event by putting it on the page. Oh, that's a good question. I think now I'm less concerned when it comes to attitude and so on. I think I'm less concerned now about being too personal or too intimate in my writing. I was kind of standoffish when I first started writing. I don't think that's all bad, but I was very reluctant to deal with things that were intimate, because I was afraid of being maudlin or sentimental or sloppy, and I didn't want that. So I approached the poems, I think, a little bit differently, and sometimes I would come up with a persona, Alvin Turner, for example, or somebody else who would do the talking for me. And that was a way of removing myself at least one time from my subject matter. I don't think I feel that I need to do that much anymore. I've been writing a little more prose, and certainly in the memoir, you can talk about those things. I don't think you should talk about intimate things sloppily. Yes. But I think you should talk about them, and I'm just less reluctant now to do that than I was at the beginning. I think some of that has to do with age, and when as you grow older, you're maybe just a little bit less concerned about people's reactions. I don't frankly care what academicians think about my work. That doesn't. I used to concern myself. I don't concern myself with that anymore. They may or may not like it. I don't know. I just try to get it in the form that I like, that I think works. And I'm at this point in my life, I'm too old to worry about whether some academician or somebody else approves, disapproves, likes, or dislikes. You can't satisfy everybody out there anyway. Oh, I think I do. I think one of them has to do with human connections, with the extent to which we all have something in common. That's an underlying theme, I think, in a lot of my stuff. I try not to beat that over the head, but I do think, and it starts with me, with family, the connections among members of a family, and then extends to a community, to a state, to a nation, and maybe one hopes beyond that. But I think the notion of connections is one of the underlying themes in my poems. The acceptance of other people, and that doesn't mean that you have to love everybody, but it means that you accept them. Yeah. Also, I think it's important to laugh at yourself. I don't know if that's a theme, but well, yeah, that's one of the great escapes we have. It's one of the great consolations we have, is that we can laugh with each other, and we can laugh at ourselves. And heaven knows there are a lot of times when we ought to be laughed at. Oh, I've changed. I've gone from one time to another. Right now, morning. I find myself freshest in the mornings, between, say, 9 o'clock and noon. Sometime in there, I may write for 3 hours. Probably not. Probably an hour and a half. But almost always in the morning. That wasn't always the case. I've written several collections of poems, most of which were done at night. But I think when I was doing that, I had a little more energy, and maybe a little more energy than at night that I don't have now. So I've tried to be a little bit flexible in that regard. I do try to write something every day, though. That's always a tough one for the writer to answer. I mean, somebody else might be able to answer that better. I do know that I admire greatly a distinctive voice in other people's writings. And the voices that I admire most in literature, or some of the voices I admire most in literature, are those developed by William Faulkner and Mark Twain. They have a nice, Chaucer also, Well, they all have a sense of humor. They all appreciate the value of understatement and of irony. And those are things that I try to get in my voice. As I said, I'm a small town guy, so there's a lot of small town idiomatic stuff in my in my writing. I just hope that voice, you know, is distinctive, but it's really tough for the writer to discern that. Probably the reader would have a better notion of whether that voice is like everybody else's voice or whether it is distinctive. Most of the time I write with myself in mind. I mean, I try to satisfy myself, but my assumption there is that if I'm satisfied as an audience, then there are some other people out there who are at least a little bit like me who might be satisfied. There are exceptions to that. I write children's stories, and of course, when I do that, I have to have younger people in mind. Not a particular type of younger person, but you know, you have to avoid certain polysyllabic enormities, you know, in your vocabulary. So when you're dealing with young people, it's you have to have an awareness that you don't want to talk down to them, but on the other hand, you don't want to sound like a New York Times book critic. Well, I'd say write first and worry about or think about the publishing later. I would borrow a line from Henry James, who, when a young woman asked him what she could do to be a better writer, said, "Try to be one of those persons on whom nothing is lost." Try to be one of those persons on whom nothing is lost. Pay attention, take notes, write. And if you do that as well as you can over a period of time, perhaps publication will occur. You know, I guess I haven't been entirely aware of the extent to which, you know, a teacher influences other people. I'm delighted that it does happen. I've had some awfully good students. You know, it's great to be able to take a little bit of credit for writers who who could have done it on their own anyway. And I think of, you know, there's so many in Lincoln and around Nebraska. I've had, you know, Twyla Hansen in class, and Marge Sizer, and Ron Block, and just any number of wonderful students and writers, and some of the children too have gone on. When we started Poets in the Schools here in Lincoln in the 1970s, came into contact with so many teachers and so many young people, and still do. I'm out at North Star now with the class, and was out at Southwest last year, and will be out in Saratoga shortly. It's just that when you make contacts with so many good people, some of whom are very fine writers, I guess some of them are generous and kind to the extent that they give you some credit, and one deeply appreciates that. I do. Right. And I know that sounds kind of trite or pedestrian, but to keep writing is not maybe all that easy. I keep thinking I want to write a novel, but I haven't come up with that. But I remember when I finished my first memoir, This Death by Drowning, I never thought I'd write another one, and then I did, and the University Press brought it out recently. Yes. Restoring the Burnt Child, it's called. And I'm not so sure now that I don't want to try another one. These are all autobiographical, but they're not chronological. So I take a theme, a water theme in one book, a fire theme in another, and draw from my experiences to fit that theme. I would just like to continue doing what I'm doing, writing some poems and maybe some stories. As my children and grandchildren get older, they approach them from different angles, and it's fun to have new stuff to give them. Well, one of the latest novels that really moved me, actually, were two of them. The two most recent novels that have moved me considerably. One is called The River Warren by Kent Myers, M-E-Y-E-R-S. absolutely astonishing novel. And about the same time I was reading that, no, it was after that, I guess, Kent Harif's Plain Song. I thought was a very powerful book, though I taught his first novel, The Tie That Binds, several times. And I still think that is one of the finest novels, The Tie That Binds, that I've read in the last 12, 15 years. Lately I've been reading, and I guess every poet has, Billy Collins' poems. I find them, he was the poet, he served as the National Poet Laureate for a while. And I find his poems very accessible, exciting, fresh, original, and they're poems that make contact, with my students. That's not always the case, but his poems I found really amazingly fresh. So I like him a lot. I've been reading a lot of Stephen Dunn poems also. I find them, I don't read systematically. I'm helter-skelter. I pick up this, that, and so on. And I don't let my reading come into conflict or interfere with, I should say, with my writing. Though I find that I write more, and I think I write better, I don't know, but I think I write better when I'm reading things. And sometimes I go back and read some older stuff too. Some of those authors that I mentioned earlier. I was knocked out several years ago by A River Runs Through It, Norman Maclean's short memoir. I've read that half a dozen times. It's just a wonderful book. I guess each of us has books, stories, poems, that do that to us.
Go back to again.
And those are the ones we go back to, right? And I know they're different ones, you know, for different people. It's nice to be back in the Heritage Room. It's nice to have been invited the first time. Doubly nice to be invited back. I'm going to do something tonight that I haven't done before in a reading. I'm going to take an event from my own experience and read and talk a little bit about it from 3 different angles. I thought I would do this because I know that most of you write. You write poems, you write stories, you write letters, and probably you know everything that I'm going to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. I wrote, in 1982, I wrote a poem about the near death of my little brother when we went swimming in a sand pit about 2 miles from town. So I'm going to start with that poem. This poem is what, help me, Burke. This poem is 21 years old. It has a lugubrious title. It's called Beginning Then Myself for the First Authentic Time to Die, I Keep on Dying. Don't you wish you had thought of that? Yeah. I thought it would look good on the marquee, but the movie people haven't bought it yet. I had never seen that much blood before. I had never seen a cut artery before. So I was impressed. I was young. I was impressed with the amount, but I was also impressed with the spurting nature of the artery. And finally, I was impressed that this was my brother's blood, and that made a difference. So I attempt to deal with that in this poem. Beginning then myself for the first authentic time to die, I go on dying. Only moments before I heard my brother calling out for help, I saw a baby bull snake pause in a tuft of shadow cast by bunch grass. A sign, maybe. A bad sign, probably. And sure enough, the water in the sand pit darkened, and my brother's blood trailed him brightly out of the water. The bulk of my brother's long, young body itself trailing the hands of the one who I think to this day saved him. You must understand first that at the bottom of the roadside pit lay an ancient Hudson, that for whatever cockeyed reason plowed through a curbing of gravel and sailed, no doubt, like the torso of a bright blue game bird, smack into the center of the pit. Understand that the young driver survived, that his steady beside him did not, that for all those years her long hair in our dreams tugged, more blonde than sinister, at the scalp that in the front seat, how many fathoms down, lay in the lap of a different lover. Who in his right mind would want anything further to do with such a car? Holding our breaths to the edge of bursting, our eyes wide, we scavenged its hulk, inside and out, dashboard and glove box, gear knob and clutch. And it was sorry Berman's boy, L.C., who held the record for time spent sitting buoyantly behind the wheel, who drove that buggy of death, he said, round trip to Medicine Lodge. The hulk, meanwhile, and before and after, settling itself to its axles in the sand. And meanwhile, too, my brother's right foot pumping blood, L.C., the L for Leroy, saying, artery, artery, thumb and finger of one hand circling my brother's lower leg, thumb and finger pressing now releasing. Understand that hereafter the dream thickens. The girl's blonde hair less blonde, now more sinister. Rising and rising in water darkened by my brother's blood, the boy behind the wheel having smashed the glass to leave the shard that, disguised as moss, will draw the blood to darken once and for all memory of water. Understand, not even Elsie's thumb and finger circling my brother's leg, pressing now releasing, can purge the dream. Nor old Montzingo, our doctor, the heft of his deep liquid voice settling cool and antiseptic into the large dark eye of the victim. Oh, understand just this. Beginning then, for the first authentic time to die, I go on dying. My brother, tough little mudcat, meanwhile heals, lives to swim his tough immortal fins deep into another and yet another flat south central Kansas summer. Well, he always did have, so Mother said, more guts than common sense. Franklin, my brother. Down, down, down he goes. Deep breath swallowed, eyes wide, hands at the ends of long arms parting water. And I in the bubble of his slow, narrow wake, wild in the wreckage of our little years to know forever and a day at least the fact of one surviving one another. Well, that's a poem, and there are a couple of details in the poem that are inaccurate, deliberately inaccurate. I know that will shock you. One is I call the older boy who made the tourniquet with his hand. I called him LC's boy. That's not true. His name was Carter Leroy Hayes, and he was the son of Margaret Hayes. And I call my brother in the poem Franklin, and that's not accurate. My brother's name is Johnny Lee. And I'm not quite sure why I changed those names. I think at the time I wrote it, I was hyper-conscious of names. Names I was using from my own family and from the community. And I just won't use Carter's actual name. I won't use my brother's actual name, and didn't. That's my excuse in any case. My brother does figure in a number of the poems in this book. I'm reading from an old book called Houses and Beyond, and I did want the reader to know that Franklin is my brother. So at the start of the book, or near the start of the book, I acknowledge that. For Franklin, dirty little beautiful little lizard, who scrubbed and thus unadorned is my brother, John. So when I finished, I decided, well, I want to use his name, so I used it at the beginning, if that makes any kind of sense whatsoever. The same incident, then, I wrote about in my first memoir called This Death by Drowning. And I would like to read an excerpt from that. You will hear some of the same details, but you will also hear some different details. I think one of the important elements of a poem that you finally are satisfied with is what you leave out. What you leave out of a poem is perhaps as important as what you put into the poem. But when you leave something out, well, you've left something out. You may feel that the poem is finished, but there are still things out there related to the person or to the event that can be dealt with from a different angle, a different perspective, perhaps a different genre. In the poem, I'm trying to suggest the marvel of one surviving one another. That seems to me a marvelous thing. Sometimes just an element of chance is responsible for that. But the day that happened was an absolutely wonderful day in Kansas. And I don't mention that. I don't talk about that in the poem. So here's an excerpt from This Death by Drowning that deals with that same event. At the moment, I am with my brother at Ely's sandpit. And with us is our mentor, an older boy with dark hair and the trace of a mustache, behind which I swear I can see a young Clark Gable. His name is Carter Leroy Hayes, and though he is the oldest, he is not the first to hit the water. The first is my daredevil brother, John. We are naked and looking pitifully white, fish-belly white, as Huckleberry Finn might put it. It is a bright afternoon in August, and two of us, my brother and I, are here against the will of our parents. Carter, on the other hand, is entirely free of anything remotely resembling a heavy conscience. His parents are his grandparents, his original mother and father having delivered him into the older couple's care, and then, apparently, as if liquid, evaporating. The grandparents are old and sedentary and spiritual. Given a choice between bulldozer and faith to move a mountain, both, without a moment's hesitation, would opt for faith. They love their grandson, who failed the 5th grade twice, and they provide evidence of their love by permitting him to do any damn thing he pleases. Carter is not stupid. He failed the 5th grade twice because the 5th grade failed him. Nothing about it could catch and hold his attention. He was an independent spirit, and it seemed to me a natural-born teacher because he was a natural-born storyteller. He illustrated his stories with his hands, his long and delicate fingers fluttering or not fluttering at all of the precisely right moments. His green eyes, my father's eyes were green, my own eyes are green, Gable's eyes must have been green, making contact now and again with each member of his congregation. Carter Hayes it was who first told me and my brother how the body of an ancient Hudson had come to rest at the bottom of Ely's sandpit. And he tells the story then, the one that I related to you earlier. So again we go there, but we're not supposed to the sandpit. Carter and I and my brother, all of us barefooted, my brother and I wearing only denim jeans, Carter in tan wash pants and a white t-shirt. We go there to get out of town. We go to feel the sun above the shoulders and the good, rich earth of Kansas under the feet. We go because two of us aren't supposed to. And we go because we want to explore again the body of that mysterious Hudson terraplane. My brother is fearless and can hold his breath almost forever. He is 2 years younger than I. His birthday, 12 November, the same date that the Juneau took its first torpedo. He is 9, I am 11. Carter is older. The Juneau was the ship on which the 5 Sullivan brothers were aboard. when it was sunk by a Japanese torpedo in I think it was 1944, November 12. So under a high August sun, we bask and we dip in Ely's sandpit. Carter tells us again the story of the terraplane and its lovely, unfortunate victim. I hold my nose and kick myself downward until with my free hand I can feel first the top of the Hudson, then the hood all the way to where its ornament would be if somebody hadn't stolen it. Shortly before my lungs explode, I break the water's surface, gulping then the sweet ambiance of oxygen. It is one of those summer days in Kansas when the sun doesn't move, perhaps because there isn't any wind to move it, perhaps because of its own stifling heat, perhaps because it has a mind of its own and doesn't want to. The water in Ely's sandpit is unusually clear. Now and then I see a carp moving slowly and securely, as if a peacetime submarine in the direction of Moss. Now there's another element of potential disaster, that carp and its brethren. Swimming naked, I want no part of me to be misconstrued as bait. Did I mention that my brother is a daredevil? Don't draw a line and challenge him to cross it unless you have your fists closed and cocked. He is not overly aggressive, he laughs easily and frequently, and should he live a long, long time, he might one day grow a mouth sufficient unto his middle upper teeth. He has no quarrel with the world. He is instead a Renaissance young man yearning to try everything and to perform to perfection everything he does. He had been the first one into the water. He hit it at a gallop, his little pecker swinging like a metronome. Once into the laving liquid of the sand pit, my brother, as a rule, doesn't leave it until we head for home. He swims cleanly and without apparent effort. He dives and disappears and emerges sleek as a dolphin. Even today, my brother can hold his breath forever. That August afternoon at Ely's sandpit, he held it perhaps a bit too long, even by his own admission. He had dived deep under, he said, to explore again the Hudson, and decided this time to swim through a window and seat himself behind the wheel to drive that sorry terraplane. How far? From town to Timbuktu? From hell to breakfast? My brother's account of this voyage was an epic worthy of Homer or Virgil, or, more appropriately, of Dante or Melville. For my brother had descended into a watery inferno and survived to tell. So he told it, in more detail than I care to recount, as Carter and I took turns carrying him across an ocean of wheat stubble back into town. He had cut the artery, he believed, on a shard of window glass on the passenger side of the Hudson after he had done his touring and was leaving the vehicle to return to the realm of the finless to resupply his oxygen. He hadn't realized how deep the gash was or how wide. Thus he had waited until the last moment to call for help. At that time, my 9-year-old brother was not much bigger, as our mother often said, than a minute. Why a minute? Why not at least an hour? But each of his molecules, from his blonde hair down through his oversized teeth to his flat feet, was both animated and fearless, if not downright foolhardy. I could scarcely believe that such a small body might contain so much blood. Carter had heard his call for help and had believed it. In an instant he was in the water, his arms and legs churning in a chaotic tandem, rudder and paddle wheel explosive and seamless, and almost before I knew what was going on, Carter had my brother on his stomach, draining him with one hand against his back and with the other applying pressure to the most relevant point. Much of Ely's sandpit was a wake of redness, a red snake gorging itself on water, until finally the snake would turn to pinkness, eventually then to be taken in, purged and colorless by the very water it had fed on. True redness, meanwhile, came in spurts from my brother's foot whenever Carter released the pressure. Artery and spurt. Those words no less than stuka and zero and sortie are magic. My brother's blood, one of two rednesses by which I have come to measure all redness. That voyage across a sea of stubble, now that I view it from the other end of the telescope, appears too archetypal to be passed over lightly. Observe this. My little brother, whiter than any lily, but undaunted, yielding himself to the older arms of our buddy and mentor, Carter Hayes. Observe this. Long fingers on Carter's right hand pressing from time to time that crucial blood flow point on my brother's lower body. And this, my brother's older brother in lockstep with his companion, clodhoppers kicking dust and stubble as he listened to the victim's account of his own private voyage in the terraplane. Well, didn't Odysseus spend much of his life on water? Water to take him away, water for his return? Didn't Aeneas carry his father, Anchises, safely away from the burning and toppling towers of Ilium? Didn't Dante experience the considerable swirl and spurt of redness? Consider, for example, the plight of the suicide on his descent into perdition. Didn't Ahab, that splendid monomaniac, finally confront more water than he had bargained for? With Carter beside me doing most of the carrying, I walked across 1 mile, then another, of dry south-central Kansas earth. Above us a sun that had cast off from its moorings and in all due time would send shards of red and pink and aqua, then blue into purple, then purple into purple black, then black, up and away from a perfectly flat horizon. We meanwhile trudge along, Carter and my brother and I. Against his ankle, my brother's red blood is infinitely thick, profoundly red, remotely lovely. His story as real as any account, ancient or otherwise, that might never have happened. And that's perhaps half of the account in this death by drowning. And probably you can hear that the tone there is different from the tone in the poem. And certainly a lot of the details are either different or have been added to the memoir. Sometimes the event is more expansive than the poem will let it be. And that's not a criticism of the poem, that's just a fact. Sometimes it's that way. Have you ever felt that way in your own writing? I used to believe that once I had written my poem about my maternal grandmother, I was through with my maternal grandmother. Not so. I've written dozens of poems about her, and I still have many poems to write about her. And she crawls into, creeps into, runs into my fiction from time to time, and into the memoir. It's as if any event that really means something to us, or anybody who really means something to us, cannot be written about enough. And what I'm suggesting is that we try occasionally to write about that person or that event or that combination from different perspectives and in different genres. Try a one-act play after the poem, or try a novel after the memoir. The third and final part is a section that deals again with that event in my new collection of short stories called Shadowboxing. It's so new that it smells so new. And the cover looks like that. Shadowboxing. That's supposed to be that's an Everlast boxing glove. The title story is the longest story in the book by quite a bit, and it's the opening story. There are 5 stories in the collection. I'm going to read, though, from one called Distances. The same event, my brother's not near drowning, I guess, as nearly dying from a lack of blood. That event again. The jump from the memoir to fiction is probably greater than the jump from the poem to the memoir, because you're free. You can feel free to invent whatever you like. It's fiction, but you're still beginning with that core, or at least I was in this example, beginning with that core. The story deals with 2 young people in high school, Galen and Julie. Galen is very shy and very introspective, and has very little to do with others, especially with gals. His attitude begins to change when his teacher writes a poem on the board. And it's, I quoted in here somewhere, "When as in silks my Julia goes." Do you know that poem? She writes it out in its entirety on the board. Robert Herrick's little poem. "When as in silks my Julia goes, then, methinks, how sweetly flows the liquefaction of her clothes. Next, when I cast mine eyes and see that brave vibration, each way free, oh, how that glittering taketh me." And when Galen sees that on the board and hears his teacher, with whom he's about half in love, it really shakes him. It's the first time I think that he has been truly and deeply moved by lines that talk on the blackboard. These Robert Herrick lines, "the liquefaction of her clothes." So he begins to fall in love with the woman, the girl in the poem, Julia. And then, as luck would have it, a new girl moves to town and joins his class, and her name is Julie. And she has a lot in common with Galen. She's also rather shy. And they hit it off very well. Though they don't talk a lot, they just hit it off in their own quiet, conservative, modest ways. They hit it off quite well. And this one thing leads to another until finally they indulge a ritual that all of the high schoolers at one time or another indulge. And they must do this in order to be fully accepted. And it may sound to some of you a little bit silly, and if it does, that's because you've forgotten high school. In any case, at some point, the couple, enamored of each other, must go to this sand pit and skinny dip. And Julie and Galen do. Ordinarily, this is done by the couple at night, but Julie and Galen do it in daylight. And they do it, it's called distances because they keep their distances. Distances kept throughout the story are very, very important. Well, they're talking about the experience. They've skinny dipped. They're now sitting on the sand beside the water, talking about Julie's brother, Knox, who is in the Marine Corps. The story is set during World War II. "We don't know where Knox is," Julie said. Her dark hair, beaded with water, had lost none of its thickness. "Dad says maybe Saipan. I think he reads the paper more than he lets on." Galen sat close enough to Julie that he could drape one side of the quilt over his right leg. She had brought a quilt with her. He was studying the butterfly pattern in the quilt. Each butterfly, one yellow, one red, another green and blue, was enclosed in a square with a white border. "Grandmother did this one all by hand," Julie said, noting that Galen seemed more involved with the quilt than in hearing of her brother's potential whereabouts. Galen nodded. "Yes, lovely. But no more lovely than improbable. It should be on a tour of county fairs, collecting purple ribbons, or better yet, on a bed in a museum room. On the bed's headboard, the caution, 'Do not touch.' Instead, here it was, on a stretch of sand between Shannon's Pond," Ely's Pond now has become Shannon's Pond, "and a grove of catalpas, serving as a colorful palette on which sat two naked high schoolers indulging a ritual Galen, if not Julia, had never endorsed and certainly had never intended to enter into." "Well," Galen said, "we did it." "And we did it in broad daylight," Julie said. Her slightly off-center smile gave Galen the shivers. "That should earn us some bonus points." Galen nodded, permitting himself as he did so a long look at Julie's breasts. flawless white cones with nipples pink and surprisingly large. "You can touch me if you'd like," Julie said. Galen smiled, shook his head. "That's all right." Then, "Now look, close your eyes and count backwards slowly from 20. Then see if you can find me," he said. She hesitated, frowning. Then, shrugging her shoulders, she closed her eyes and began to count. Galen stood and moved quickly across the sand, and then, as quietly as he could, he entered the water. Taking a deep breath, he went under, working arms and legs to send him to the center of the pit, where, paddling downward, he soon could see the hulk of the old Ford coupe. Well, you know, Hudsons have become Fords. As his right hand touched the frame, he felt something move briskly across his back. Carp. He knew there were carp in the pond, some of them massive, more than a yard long, but when he turned quickly to his side, he saw not a carp, but Julie, her body as if a sleek white gull, moving in the water as smoothly as a bird glides through air. He watched her enter the old vehicle through the shattered back window, watched as she positioned herself behind the wheel, as if she fully intended to drive the coupe out of the pit and onto the beach beside the quilt. Galen needed more oxygen. He turned away from the vehicle, pushing himself upward. Soon he broke the surface of the water with a gasp, then side-stroked slowly toward the catalpas. He was on the beach, drying himself with the quilt, when he saw Julie come toward him. Her freestyle carried her over the water so swiftly she hardly seemed to touch it. When she reached the edge of the pond, she stood quickly on one leg and hopped awkwardly toward Galen, her arms outstretched for balance. Just as she fell against him, Galen noticed that her raised foot, the right one, was spurting blood. "It's an artery," Julie said, "I think." Galen steadied her with one arm while spreading the quilt as best he could with the other. He helped her onto her back, telling her to stay calm, his advice spoken in a soft but throaty voice, as if it were directed more at himself than at Julie. She kept her bleeding foot elevated until Galen could position his laid-down bicycle beneath it, her ankle resting on the edge of the seat. Blood came from the foot in short, measured spurts. "Galen," Julie said, "is it an artery?" "Yeah, and it's bleeding pretty bad. It's all over the quilt." He closed one hand around her ankle and squeezed until the spurting slowed, then stopped. Her ankle was small, white, delicate. "I'll need a tourniquet," he said. "I'll use my shirt." He released his grip, found the white T-shirt, and tied it loosely around Julie's ankle. The blood already had begun its spurting. Galen twisted the knot until the cloth tightened. Then he twisted it some more. Slowly, the spurting stopped. "We can't use the bike," he said, "and we can't wait until someone happens along the road." He eased the tourniquet to permit a slow seepage of blood. "I'll have to carry you. Let's get dressed." Quickly, he slipped into his wash pants and shoes, then returned to the tourniquet. He tightened it slowly. The bleeding eased off. "Now," Galen said, "I'll give you a hand." He helped her into the yellow blouse and black skirt, then worked the tourniquet again to reduce the bleeding. One side of the butterfly quilt was soggy. He lifted her and turned to the southwest. The shortest distance, of course, would be a straight line, and that line would take them through the heart of the catalpas. Midway through the grove, Galen lowered Julie to the ground to work the tourniquet. He found a short catalpa stick and eased it under the knot. With the stick, he could tighten and release the tourniquet quickly and easily, could snag one end of the stick against the cloth to keep the tourniquet snug as he carried her. At first, Julie had seemed no heavier than a small child, but when they left the shade of the catalpa grove to move in the bright July sunlight, the weight seemed to double. In the distance, Galen could see the outlines of the Danville elevator and water tower, outlines that shimmered in the heat that seemed to rise from an extensive plain of golden stubble. Stopping frequently to ease the tourniquet, gave Galen a chance to catch his breath. He was following a fence line that divided the Shannon acreage from the Davis property, a barbed wire fence line that eventually they would have to slide under to keep a straight line, more or less, intact. When Julie spoke, Galen turned quickly his attention away from the shimmering outlines. She was smiling. "Bet you didn't know I'm such a terrific swimmer." Galen shook his head. Bet you're right. He didn't know how often to stop to release the pressure, but he had read somewhere that if the circulation were shut off too long, restoring it might not be possible. And what then? Amputation? And the story goes on as he proceeds to carry Julie back to town, and tells then what happens, or perhaps doesn't happen, when they get back to town. The story, of course, in so many ways different from the creative nonfiction and from the poem. Two things, though, it still has in common with the nonfiction and the poem. One is that it begins with that event, that cut artery. That is kind of the starting point, not for the story, but for the thinking of the story. And two, the title of the poem, beginning then myself for the first authentic time to die, I keep on dying, suggests that I believe I first realized my mortality when I watched my brother bleeding from an artery. I believe that. I believe that I first realized not only my own mortality, but that that we are all mortal. And I think that's what Galen realizes in the story. He's never had a he's never had a connection with anybody that was intimate to the extent that he feared that individual's loss. But when he comes into contact with Julie, and he comes into contact with her partially through that poem. When he comes into contact with her, and when the artery is cut, and he is the one who has to see to it that the blood stops, that the blood is allowed to flow, and that the blood stops again. He's the one who has to see to that if she is going to live. So he becomes, in his connection with her, a member of mortal humanity. So I think the poem and the story have that in common, if that makes any sense at all. Not all the stories I write come about in that way, of course. As you know, stories come about, oh my, in many different ways, from angles that sometimes we simply can't anticipate. But what I'm saying is that once in a while, something happens to us, something has happened to us, that is bigger than a poem, that is bigger than a chapter or half a chapter in a memoir, and wants to be told maybe in a short story, or wants to be told in a novel. And to permit oneself to try not only the poem, but also the memoir and the fiction or the play or whatever, is perhaps to realize the extent to which that event has influenced the writer, and probably will continue to influence the writer. So my reading is perhaps less a reading than it is a kind of mini lecture, though I don't like that word particularly, on how sometimes a short story can evolve.